Hi, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the start of a new week. And hope this finds you all well. And trust the signal of the stream is getting out there. Do the normal routine, by the way, which before we kick off and we introduce our special Monday night guest. Want you to do the usual. So if you like, if you're watching this on Facebook, share and like it. If you're on YouTube, share, subscribe. Make sure you have the notification bell pressed, because the naughty folks sometimes unfollow us. If you want to follow my other social media channels, they're all down below. You can find them in the description box below. Very important this. If you enjoyed the next 60 minutes, give us a thumbs up, please. Thumbs up. This is your job. I'm talking right at you now. Thumbs up if you like it. And if you don't like it, I really don't know why we have the thumbs down. Everybody likes it, right? And then last but not least, a couple of quickies. Go to altnewsmedia.net/subscribe and drop £1 in the hat if you want. That's one way to keep alternative channels like this going. So if you do that, and then the other thing to say is, of course, that get your message noticed with a super chat, so you can hit those. Now, there's loads of stuff we could have talked about tonight. We could have talked about Nicola Sturgeon getting. Oh, what a surprise! Did you see that Nicola was found not to have misled or done anything naughty at all? That came as such a shock to me, that one. And I was also equally surprised, by the way, when Boris Johnson told us that the third wave might be coming our way and there might be consequences for that. Never seen that one coming as well. But anyway, those are stories I decided not to talk about. And instead, what we're going to talk about is I'm going to bring our guest on now. We're going to talk about what I consider the absolute state of British policing and in some ways the British judiciary and, of course, British politics. So those are tonight's topics framed around some of the events that you and I have seen in the past couple of weeks in particular. So anyway, without further ado, drum roll, let me bring on Jon Holnbrook. Welcome to the stream, Jon.
Hello, David. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you back, Jon. We were talking just before we came on air. In my mind, it only seems like yesterday since you were on the stream, but so much happens in this fast-moving political world, and gosh, it's hard to keep up. But it's very good to see you, and it's great to have you back with us, Jon. A lot of people really enjoyed your last appearance on this one, so we're looking forward to your thoughts tonight. So, and thanks, I see you all joining. That's fine. Thanks everyone. Hello to you all. Jon, what I wanted to talk about, I did sum it up there. What I consider the absolute state of British policing, which is a sort of Twitterish way of saying what's just going on. And obviously, Jon, to set this conversation up, I wanted to start with the events in Bristol at the weekend. Now, because this is YouTube and Facebook, we can't show videos because that would cause hurty feelings. But there's a couple of things, things I just want to throw up, a few images just to set the scene, Jon. So if we can have the first one, please. Oh yeah, do you remember this one from a year ago? Why Bristol police can take the knee in Black Lives Matter protest? That was June 2020. You remember that? What happened since then? Next slide, please. Bristol should be proud. Oh, you can't make this up, Jon. Bristol should be proud over the destruction of the Colston statue, says the police chief. So that was interesting. And then more to the point, and this is what we all saw happening on, I think it was Saturday night. Yeah, I mean, these absolutely terrible images of wanton violence, Jon, and thuggery, and attempted arson, and terrible things to have to witness in the same city where, further images like this. I just unbelievable. Okay, let's take the images away. Bring Jon back and myself back up. Jon, what did you think of what we saw down in Bristol the other night?
Well, those images are awful, aren't they? And if ever there was a picture that painted 1,000 words, it's those pictures, really.
Yeah.
Because I think we all woke up this morning to see those pictures and were shocked. This is Bristol. This is in Britain, where there has been considerable lawlessness, wanton violence and vandalism, police officers hurt. The police station seems to be in the centre of the target, and police vehicles have been burning. So, you know, on a small scale, the rule of law broke down in Bristol last night, and that really ought to trouble us all. But my instinctive response on seeing those pictures, and I started to see them last night, was just as you've done, David, to be reminded of what the Bristol police chiefs did in the summer. And my instinctive response, which I tweeted out last night, was that you essentially reap what you sow. And I think the pulling down of the Colston statue in, I think it was June, wasn't it, by the BLM protesters, that was one of the most troubling incidents that I think I observed last year, because it wasn't just that the statue came down; it was the attitude of the police that I think caused a number of us to be very concerned. Because the chief police officer said, and your clipping has just confirmed this. The police officer said, "Look, we understand why this statue needed to come down. We understand how certain sections of this community feel, and we stood by to let it happen." Now, I know they said that they stood by to avoid further aggravation, but that simply isn't good enough for the police force. If we don't have a police force that can police the streets and keep law and order, then heaven help us. And, you know, it got worse, didn't it? Because then we learned that very same chief officer in Bristol gets rewarded with a gong in the New Year's honours list. So, you know, what is our political class telling us? It's essentially telling us that they have lost the ability to govern. And when you show weakness, like they have shown, particularly in Bristol for so many months, I'm afraid that incidents like that are the result.
One of the things, John, as well, putting it in context, so that happened in Bristol, as you say, yesterday, but the day before in London, we had a kind of an anti-lockdown demonstration, which I think I'm sure you probably saw as well, which was pretty well attended, I think, you know, and it seemed to me to be pretty much peaceful. But I saw images, John, on, I'm not sure, one of the parks, it might have been Hyde Park, anyway, some park in London, where we seen, you know, burly police officers getting stuck in to a young man or a couple of young people who just, I don't know, I wasn't aware of anything that they'd done particularly, but they were being kicked as they lay on the ground. And, you know, what does, I mean, again, this is all bad. John, you spent your life, you know, in the law. You're a man of the law. And I've spent a lot of my time as well supporting the rule of law because of the events here in Northern Ireland. So it's very troubling to watch these scenes, like what happened on Saturday in London, to watch that and to see a police force which is acting in a way which seems very uncharacteristic of what we would have, I think, seen as the best of British policing. It's the worst of British policing.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you, David. And I think what we've noticed, particularly over the last year, in fact, probably over the last 18 months, is that there are double standards going on so far as our police force is concerned. Because generally speaking, I think the anti-lockdown protests have been heavily policed.
Yeah.
And you only have to contrast that, particularly in the summer when the BLM protests were happening in breach of all the coronavirus regulations. I mean, I didn't personally have an issue with that, but what I did have an issue with was the way that they were allowed to happen and were lightly policed, even when they turned quite violent. Whereas the coronavirus, the anti-lockdown protesters have tended to be very heavily policed. And of course, we know that Piers Corbyn, when he organised one of these demonstrations, was fined £10,000.
Yeah.
As far as I know, I don't think anyone who's organised any of these Black Lives Matter protests has been fined. And then I think the reason I say go back over 18 months is you only have to go back to the Extinction Rebellion protests that were taking place at the end of 2019 before COVID hit, and which then started up again last year. And, you know, they caused considerable inconvenience and disruption
Yeah,
I remember in particular there was one morning, wasn't there, when a lot of the national newspapers couldn't get their newspapers out because they'd been blockaded by
that's
Extinction
right.
Rebellion protesters, and yet the police, on the whole, tended to just stand aside and almost protect them.
Yeah,
These are not just ordinary demonstrations where people are expressing a point of view. These were protests which were intended to cause, their sole purpose was really to cause inconvenience, not just to newspapers, but to the working community and residents as a whole. And I experienced this many times myself when I was trying to cycle into work over uh, Waterloo Bridge, and it was very difficult because of all the protests, and it went on for days, day after day, and yet on the whole, the police policed them exceedingly lightly.
they did. I mean, the other thing about the way the police demonstrations is, we saw it, John, in the aftermath of, well, following the murder of the lady in London there about a week and a bit ago.
Yeah,
And we
Sarah
saw,
Everard.
yeah, Sarah Everard. Thank you, John. Following her murder, there were two particular rallies. There was one on Clapham Common, which was policed in pretty, probably quite robustly, but it was in sync with COVID regs. That was on one night, and then the next day they had a rally out in Parliament Green, and that was okay. So, to me, John, this raises fundamental questions about the degrees of latitude which seem to be directed by those at the top. Because I don't think we can't always blame the officers. We shouldn't necessarily. They're following orders, to borrow a phrase. But what the amount of latitude seemed to be incredible. How can it be that one night a vigil for Sarah Everard is deemed just beyond the pale, and the next day, yeah, it's fine, it's no problem? How can that be?
Yeah, well, how can it? I mean, if we're all going to have confidence that the law is to applied equally, then it has to be applied equally. And you can't have the police saying that we think that these demonstrations are okay, whereas a different sort of demonstration is not okay. And of course, what I think troubles a lot of people is the way in which the police force tend to be quite woke in their attitudes these days. So, that's why they've tended to be quite light on certainly the Black Lives Matter movement, and also on Extinction Rebellion, because they tend to be much more middle class movements, if you like. Whereas I think a lot of more ordinary people have tended to take part in the anti-lockdown protests. So
Yeah.
you can't. People quickly lose faith in the police if they are seen to be taking sides, and I think that should really trouble us all, because if we're going to have faith in the police, which we clearly need to do as a society to maintain law and order, then they have to be seen to be treating all of us equally, no matter what political demonstrations we go on. And again, you see, I think it's worse because the anti-lockdown protests have really just been traditional demonstrations where people are saying, look, we do not agree with this lockdown. And that's exactly what, in a democratic society, that's what people should be allowed to do. Whereas when you get to the Extinction Rebellion protests, they are of a different kind, aren't they? Because they are not really about saying, look, we think this. Those protests are really about trying to force us to act and think in a certain way. They're very much about undermining democracy, if you like, by having a coercive impact, such as I mentioned earlier, the way they stopped those newspapers being distributed. So that's what troubles me, because obviously the right to protest is an important part of our democracy, but it can quickly be abused if it is used to undermine our democracy, which it is when people are using protest in a coercive way.
Yeah. So, John, apologies for my abrupt departure from the stream. Even worse than the state of British policing is the state of rural broadband. Let me tell you,
Yeah.
that's
I kept talking. I figured you'd disappeared, but would come back.
that's the one good thing about you barristers. You all know how to talk, John. Yet to meet one who hasn't, but that doesn't. But no, I really appreciate that. So yeah, but John, to expand on the point, then. So we've seen this last couple of weeks this kind of well, the violence that happened in Bristol. We've seen some of the thuggery against the protesters at lockdown. We've seen the contradictions concerning the Sir Everard vigils and such. And it does make me, I mean, do you think, are the politicians really the people that we should hold culpable for, do you think they're the people that ultimately are directing the police, or do you think the police themselves and some chief constables are just doing their own thing?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, isn't it? I mean, I have been, over the last 10 minutes or so, I have been quite critical of various police officers for the partisan way in which they've decided to police some protests more heavily than others.
Yeah.
But I do think fundamentally responsibility does rest with the lawmakers, those people in Parliament. And I mean, I think particularly with the lockdown issue. I mean, I think what happened with the Sarah Everard vigil.
Yeah.
Was pretty awful, the way the police went in and manhandled the mostly women who were there.
Yeah.
But clearly they were actually doing what the law required them to do, protest under the COVID regulations at the moment. I think it's been eased a little bit now, but at the time what they were doing was unlawful, and they'd gone to court, hadn't they, the week before to try and agree terms on which that vigil could take place, and they weren't. And the court said, look, that we don't think that there are terms that will enable this protest to go ahead. So, and then it's a bit rich, isn't it, of politicians to come out, as Priti Patel did, and point the finger at the Met Police, when they have made these very same laws which the Met Police were enforcing. So, yes, I think fundamentally we've always got to point the finger at those who are most responsible, whilst also recognising that the police always have an element of discretion as to how they apply those laws. So that's why I wouldn't let either of them off the hook.
No, John, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that for a lot of the ordinary bobbies on the beat and those who are having to sometimes deal with these difficult enough, contentious demonstrations, that to see Priti Patel and actually another one, our London mayor himself, Sadiq, he was quite quick to hang the police as well on this one. And yet, as you rightly observed, John, they were ultimately only doing, to a large degree, that which the political class had told them to do. And then when the media suddenly turn around and start bitching about it, all of a sudden, like Pontius Pilate, or like Pontius Pilate, they wash their hands off the actions of the police. So I felt a bit sorry for the police, slightly sorry for the police. And I certainly agree with you, John. I think responsibility lies with government. Let's be clear. It's the government and Priti Patel, who has been an absolute, I don't know what had you high hopes of her? Because I did, and I have no hopes of her now.
I'm afraid I've never had high hopes for any of the mainstream politicians, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
I've never voted Tory. I once voted Labour. That was in 1983, and since then I haven't voted for any mainstream party, because I don't actually think there is much difference between them. I mean, I think you see it very clearly, don't you, with migration. The Tories always talk tough on immigration. Let's get net migration down to 10,000 a year, and they have never been serious about it. And the net figures, what was it last year? It was over 300,000, and moreover, and moreover, you look at the daily incursions onto British soil down at Dover in the south coast. And we just know that the government is not doing anything about it, and all these people, I think it's been, about 10,000 last year, very few of them even get returned to what is clearly a safe country, namely France, where they've come from. So, I'm not disappointed in any Tory politician, because I've never had expectations in them.
Yeah, well, that's a very pragmatic philosophy. If you don't have any expectations, you can never be disappointed. But but on the subject of police action, I say it of policing. I say, somebody mentioned it in the stream here. There was an informal beach picnic here in Northern Ireland on Saturday, on one of our very nice sandy beaches, and I was there, socially distancing, of course, and there were police there. So it was basically it was a part of a World Freedom Day demonstration in favor of restoring our freedoms and removing some, John, of the tyrannies that the political class have imposed on us all over the past year in the name of COVID. But it was interesting. I was watching that there were police in attendance, but they were very well behaved. The police were. The crowd was very well behaved. And maybe the fact there was a beach and there was ice cream vans and stuff. It wasn't really the front line as such. But I just thought, I watched the police, and they. I thought to myself, well, really, is there nothing better you could be doing? Tell me, John, is there no crime in the UK now? Has all crime gone away, and it's just really about making sure people are adhering to COVID regs? I mean, a barrister should be able to comment on this. What say you?
Well, I mean, I hear from, I never actually practiced in crime, but I mean, you just hear from people, don't you, about, they've had burglaries or they've been robbed on the streets.
Yeah.
And invariably they find the police are not interested. And, that certainly chimes with people's experience. And, when they're not enforcing the COVID restrictions, they seem to be spending a lot of time policing what we say. On social media in particular. I mean, I agree with you, David. It's almost like that they don't think that real crime happens, but we all know it does. And I think a lot of people have even given up on reporting crimes to the police now because they know that the police are not interested. Well, one other point I would make about this as well is I don't think the problem here is just with the police. I actually think a lot of our sentencing actually there's different stages, aren't there? First of all, the police tend not to pursue a lot of crimes.
Yes.
Then if they do, the CPS often drop them. And then if they do actually proceed to court and they get a conviction, I think some of the sentences handed out are just ridiculously low. And I think there's a serious problem there. And I would say it's because one of the central objectives of sentencing, as enshrined in law, is rehabilitation. And it shouldn't be. It should be punishment.
Great.
Because if you make rehabilitation as a central objective of sentencing, then that enables, for example, the offender to say, oh, don't send me to prison, I'll lose my job. And hence I'll lose the stability I have in society. And of course, that's what nearly every offender says. And judges, I'm afraid, invariably buy it. So you often see reported more often than not in the Daily Mail. I'm afraid a lot of other newspapers tend not to cover these issues. But you do often see how people have been given ridiculously light sentences because the judge will say things like, I don't want you to lose the stability you have in society. Well, I'm sorry, if you commit a crime, then you need to be punished. And it may well be that rehabilitation is a beneficial side effect of that punishment, because when you're punished, you have time to reflect on what you've done, and you may well then come out as a better person.
Well, John, I completely agree with you. For years, I've argued that, for example, the central purpose of prisons are places for punishment. I have argued that I think prisons should be made such severe places that you never ever want to go back, John. So if you commit a crime, a custodial crime that gets you a custodial sentence rather, and you end up behind bars, it should be so tough that you sure as heck never want to go back. But we've made our prisons, they may not be nice places, but they're not horrible places. And I think, again, this whole kind of, we've got to rehabilitate, which is like creeping liberalism. But I think it's manifest across the whole well, actually the policing and the judicial system from top to bottom.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with you 100% there, David. And what I would add is that I think that human rights laws has done a huge amount to undermine prison discipline. You might remember a few years ago, there was the so-called book ban that was challenged in the courts. Well, it wasn't really a book ban because prisoners were quite able to borrow from their own prison libraries. They could get whatever books they wanted. The reason why the government wanted to stop people bringing in books is because books were being used to smuggle in drugs. But you know, our laws are such, and our judiciary is such that perfectly reasonable measure taken by the minister was declared unlawful. And you know, the human rights laws have done so much to damage the ability of prisons to actually punish people by celebrating or elevating the rights, so-called, of prisoners. I mean, we know from the celebrated case of prisoners having the right to vote, which now a tiny number of them do. But I mean, it's not the tiny number that matters. What matters is the fact that human rights laws actually couldn't see that there was nothing wrong with not just depriving a prisoner of his liberty, but also as a consequence of that, depriving him of the right to vote. And that's just illustrative of the sorts of problems that that the government has had to deal with. And you know, consequently, and this I do know about because I used to do a lot of civil cases that involve people who came out of prison. They would invariably have easy and ready access to drugs in prison. And the problems caused by that, and not just the addictions that causes, but of course you get arguments and you get trading about all the drugs in prisons. I mean, it's just madness that the government can't see the problem and start addressing it, but it won't.
But I mean, I suppose it's going over the same point. But I suppose some people would have thought that, well, with a conservative government, we will get a greater grip on our, on prisons and making sure that criminals are punished. But as we've agreed, John, that's a complete and utter illusion. I feel, I don't know about you, but I think that after all these years now of conservative rule, prisons are getting softer and softer, and to the point we actually think, well, what's the point? What's the bloody point in sending them to prison if at the end of the day they've got no fear of going back? They are not. The rehabilitation is a joke as well. So I mean, what is the point of it?
Well, I agree, David. And look, let's face it. I mean, the Tories have been in power now for 11 years, haven't they? First 5 years with the Lib Dems, but 11 years in total, and the last 6 years without any encumbrance. So, they've had plenty of time to reshape the law. But a point I often raise on Twitter is, when did you last hear a government minister or spokesman talk about toughening up on law and order? I mean, I can't think of when it last happened. I mean, they keep engaging in all these stunts, by which I mean passing new laws that will ensure that people can go to prison for longer. So it's almost like they want to show or say to the public that we are tough on crime because we're passing ever longer sentences. But it's all pointless, because if you don't, first of all, catch the criminals, and if you don't then have them sentenced properly, because the full length of sentence is hardly ever used, and then if you don't have a proper penal system when the prisoner is in prison, it's all pointless. And so much of what this government does, it seems to me, is pointless, because it's all grandstanding. It's about trying to say we are doing things that are effective, but in reality, nothing changes.
No, you're right. A final word just on this topic. I kind of think, John, that one of the ways you can measure a free society is in the ability that people have to peacefully protest, to peacefully register that they're unhappy about this, that, and the other, whatever it is, be it from the right, left, don't care. But that's the measure of a free society. You have to say, John, by almost any objective measure, we increasingly don't live in that kind of society.
No, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, as I was saying earlier, I think the right to protest peacefully is an essential part of a democracy. And what is it? It's a year tomorrow, I think, since the first coronavirus laws were imposed. So basically, since the lockdown was
Yeah.
imposed, and for the best part of a year now, we have been under different forms of house arrest, haven't we? There's really no other way to
No.
describe it. You know, if you can only leave your house if you have a reasonable excuse, and if as we know, the police have very often been stopping people, and they've even been fined and prosecuted for being out of doors, mixing
Yeah.
with others, and doing things
Yeah.
which under the laws they're not supposed to do. Then that doesn't speak well, does it, for our democracy? And I think that really is quite chilling. The only sort of rider I would mention to that, though, David, is, and I suppose we're perhaps thinking about this now because of the police and crime bill that's going through Parliament.
Yep.
Is that I do think there may be one or two issues where the government does need to amend the law to deal with public order matters. I'm thinking particularly again of the Extinction Rebellion protests.
Yep. Yes. Yep.
And I have in mind here the fact that there was a legal case just over a year ago when the Met Police did stop the Extinction Rebellion protests from happening, and they imposed a
Yes.
London-wide ban. Yeah, which they can do, or at least they thought they could do under the Public Order Act. But then a couple of weeks later, that went to court, and it was declared unlawful. On the grounds that because of the disparate nature of all these different protests, you couldn't impose an across a London-wide prohibition. So when you have problems like that thrown up, then I think there's certainly a need to address that issue with possibly new laws. But again, the government, which is passing through the police and crime bill, which has very, very sweeping measures that can be used to curtail demonstrations, and it hasn't explained the justifications for any of them, it seems to me. And I suspect that's because in a lot of respects the justifications aren't there. But even where they are there, and this again comes back to what I was saying earlier about the Tory party, that they seem to be unable to articulate any reasonable argument for change. It's almost as if they are afraid of themselves and their own arguments.
No, I agree. I mean, the articulation of anything by this government seems to be gone missing in action. I mean, it's quite obvious to me, John, that this Johnson regime is possibly the most authoritarian writing over civil liberties that we've had in my lifetime. I don't remember anything like this ever happening. I mean, as I said, when I was out at this thing at the weekend on Saturday, on the way down to the beach, just to the beach line, stopped by there was two police road checks. One of the police officers, I was driving, pulled down the window, and he says, "Afternoon, sir. Can you just tell me what you're doing?" And honestly, I mean, you have to let the red mist vanish. But part of me's thinking, what the hell is it? Business of yours is what I'm driving lawfully. That's the end of the matter. But you had to say, "Oh, I'm going for a beach picnic," which was pretty much to the point. But I mean, it does make you wonder, how did we get here? We talked about hard work. John, it's general history. You understand how liberty is. You have to fight very hard to get these freedoms. But when freedoms are taken away, John, I put it to you, they tend not to be given back by government that easily. And we've lost so many of them that's what makes me so anxious and concerned about what lies ahead, because I just don't see these freedoms being brought back.
And I agree with you, David. And, it was interesting, wasn't it, that I think it was Professor Ferguson who a couple of months ago said he didn't think that the government would be able to get away with a lockdown because although they'd managed it in communist China, he and other members of SAGE didn't think they'd be able to do it in a democracy like in Britain. But sadly, they were. And I mean, in some ways, thinking back to how we were all feeling 12 months ago, I think there was a sense of concern, wasn't there? Because we knew what had happened in China and we could see what was happening in Italy. It was a new disease and none of us really knew quite what the ramifications were. But my answer to that would have been to say, well, most people actually, because I can remember cycling to work just before the lockdown was imposed, and it was noticeable that most people were not going to work, and buses would pass and they'd be nearly completely empty. And this was before lockdown. So it's like people were taking their own corrective measures. And that is really the best guarantee of liberty, isn't it? Leave the individual to decide for themselves what risks they are going to take. Once you allow the state to make those decisions for individuals, then you are on the road to unfreedom. And I agree, David. I think the government feels fortified by having got away with this. And I think as well, a major part of the problem here is that there isn't an effective opposition, is there?
No.
The Labour Party, on the whole, I mean, nearly all the other political parties and the media in particular have all been criticising Johnson for not going far enough and fast enough.
Yeah.
And I think that is what happens when ordinary people are excluded from the political process, which is unfortunately what has happened, over the last couple of decades, really. But we're really seeing how that impacts now on the loss of personal freedom and liberty.
Well, I mean, that's a great point, John, you make about the fact that the reason that the Conservatives have got away with their awful government is because Labour is even worse. And did you see, by the way, did you see that a Labour MP, I can't remember her name, but today she would not condemn the wanton violence, the attacks on the police officers and private property, which I think resulted in 2 officers being quite seriously hurt with broken bones and stuff. And she wouldn't even condemn it. I mean, this reminds me back in the day. Well, okay, I'm not going into that. This is, what does that say about modern Sir Keir Starmer's modern enlightened Labour? She won't bloody well condemn, all-out assault on the police. Labour MP.
Yeah, well, it's shocking, isn't it? But again, you see, I mean, I think back to the BLM protests in the summer. And I mean, I can remember, and I was fuming about it when I saw the commentary from the BBC reporter about how they were mainly peaceful protests.
Yeah.
And when you only have to look at what the BBC was showing us, and then if you added that to various social media feeds that were available, it was patently obvious they were anything but mainly peaceful. But again, you see that it's not just the Labour Party, which is often almost apologetic for this, but the Tory party does not come out and roundly condemn what's happened. So, for example, when the chief police officer of Bristol effectively gave the green light to the protesters to pull down the statue, I don't remember a single Tory, certainly not a minister, coming out and saying, "Oh, well, actually, I know Priti Patel did mildly rebuke the chief constable, but they don't make a big issue out of it. They ought to be saying clearly, this is not acceptable. The law of the land has to be applied," and they don't. They sit on their hands a lot of the time.
Well, that's right. In fact, actually, following the Colston statue being brought down, you will recall then when the BLM mobsters got themselves to central London, defacing the Churchill statue itself, which is, I mean, that statue over in Parliament Green there, it's iconic in so many ways. And yet, again, there wasn't an initial huge outcry. I think Conservative MPs were thinking, this is a tricky one for us. We don't want to be seen to be against the BLM, but it's Churchill. And, and we've seen the ludicrous situation of, remember when they put the boxing, they kind of covered up. Well, I thought that I seen that as a humiliation. That
I agree.
We should cover up one of our true great national heroes. And yeah, that was Boris and the gang were behind that one, John.
Yeah, no, I agree, David. And I remember as well, in the wake of the Colson statue coming down, there were a number of other institutions who quietly, on the whole, took down other statues. And, you can criticize them for being weak-willed, and probably a lot of them were, and also a lot of them were inwardly quite woke as well.
Yeah.
But part of me also thinks, well, you've got to sympathise with them because they've seen what's happened in Bristol, and they do not want a mob tearing down their property. So this is why the rule of law is so important, because everybody saw what happened there and realised that these mobsters actually had power.
Yep.
They had the power to unilaterally take down that statue. Why, by the way, was the statue not put back up?
Yep.
I mean, you know, Bristol had been discussing what to do about this statue for many years, and they had never made a decision to take it down. So had they been true to the democratic wishes of the people rather than the views of a mob, they should have put that statue back up on principle. And the government should have, I'm not saying they could have told Bristol to do that, but they could have said politically, they should have made the argument for doing it, but they didn't.
No, they didn't. No. But actually, I'm just trying to see, John, if I can find it. Yeah, I did see stuff on social media, which was Antifa UK. Were behind part of the organization, I believe, of some of the violence that we saw. And all the usual suspects. I think it was the Socialist Workers' Party. I think I saw them. They were saying, well, this is, when you stop people peacefully protesting, you got to expect a bit of violence. And again, these people should be comprehensively condemned, and it's just not there. But okay, listen, I want to move on a bit because this is interesting, John. So since we spoke last, you're now the free speech, as well as your other talents, John. You're now the free speech spokesman for UKIP. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I wrote an article in the Conservative Woman explaining why I rejoined UKIP, actually, because I was a member for 2 years between 2018 and 2020. And I went to a few meetings and did a bit of canvassing.
Yeah.
But, during that 2-year period, it was unfortunate that UKIP was rather tearing itself to pieces. So I didn't renew my membership, but I have now. And I was supported by Neil Hamilton when I was being cancelled as a barrister, and I greatly appreciated that support. And having spoken to Neil Hamilton a few times, it does seem to me he has got some very good ideas about how UKIP can put its past behind it and build and go forward. And fundamentally, David, what I think, then this relates to so much of what you and I have just been talking about. Ordinary people don't have a voice in politics anymore. And I think UKIP actually gave people a voice, didn't they, when they were very skillfully able to marshal ordinary people behind getting us out of the EU. And let's face it, without UKIP, we would probably never have had Brexit. So UKIP just needs to be able to find a way of reconnecting with ordinary people, because they do not have a voice in political debates at the moment. And I suppose for sure I could have stayed as an individual writing articles and intervening in political debates that way. Yeah. But quite honestly, there's no shortage of people who do that, and I'm not belittling it because I think it's very important. But I actually think there are probably too many people who do it, and not enough who actually get involved in trying to build a party and a movement that can bring about change. And I think America is a very good example of how you can bring about change with a party and a movement, much as the Republican Party and Trump's MAGA movement has been able to do. And unless we can build something like that in this country, then I fear the worst for us.
Well, John, I interviewed Neil Hamilton about, I think it was maybe 5 or 6 weeks ago. He came on and we had a very pleasant chat. I found him to be. I've met Neil and his wife some years ago, so I find him to be pretty impressive, actually. To be honest, given the chaos that UKIP went through over the last three or 4 years, the sort of revolving door of leaders and all that malarkey. So I found him to be, a very pleasant and a nice guy, and I seem to have a vision for UKIP. One of the things I asked him, John, and you can expand on this one now. I remember saying to him, Neil, I just seen on the social media that Katie Hopkins has joined the party. Do you think you'll have a role for her? And being the good politician that he is, he said he couldn't possibly comment on that. And then the next day, or later the same day, actually, out came the word that Katie was on the shortlist for London. She's #1 in London, isn't she? I think, Katie.
Yeah, I'm not sure, to be honest, David. I haven't followed that.
Yeah. Well, the thing about it is that, from my point of view, that aside, apart from the fact that Neil Hamilton could have told me an exclusive, and didn't. Neil, if next time you come on, I'm going to talk to you about that. But no, London to me is a great one, John, on a serious note, because London sums up all that's worst about Britain and maybe some of the things that's good about Britain. Certainly its past and all of that. But London under Sadiq Khan has become, a savage land in many parts of London. And crime has spiraled out of control, John. We've seen terror attacks in London. I mean, there's so little not to like about London, and yet here we're going to have elections to the London Assembly. And do you think UKIP can, in this kind of crucible of political activity, do you think UKIP can perform in London, John?
Well, yes, I do, and I certainly hope it does. But look, you see, look, there's only room for one populist party, if you like, and I hope that becomes UKIP. I am troubled. I was troubled actually by the Brexit Party when it set up. What was it, about 2.5 years ago now? And I was troubled by that because, apart from the fact that did actually a huge amount of damage to UKIP, I never believed in a party that didn't have members. And I think a lot of people have overlooked this problem. And now it's rebranded as Reform UK. It still doesn't have members. Anyone can click a box to say they want to be sent information. And that's as good as it gets. You become a supporter or a follower, but you have no say in the organization whatsoever. So the central problem that I want to address, which is how to engage ordinary people, is most definitely not going to be addressed by what is now Reform UK. And neither is it going to be addressed by Reclaim, Lawrence Fox's party. I happen to think, just like Nigel Farage was a good guy, and I think Lawrence Fox is a good guy. Mm-hmm. I like a lot of the things that Lawrence Fox in particular has been saying, particularly in his willingness and ability to challenge the woke. But I don't think you can succeed without members. You have to be a sort of bottom-up party which has strong branches, and those branches decide who their representatives are. I mean, again, you see it in America. Trump was only able to achieve half of what he achieved, wouldn't have achieved half of what he achieved if he hadn't had a movement that was backing him. Because the political class, the media class are very clear about how they want to stop ordinary people having any influence over policy, and you can only overcome that if you involve those people.
Well, you see, that's an interesting point. Now, I agree with that, John, but then there's a question I want to ask you. Trump achieved, I think, an awful lot because he melded the MAGA movement onto the GOP, the Republican Party. And even though in some ways that was an uneasy marriage, and it's still uneasy, I think because the Republican Party is it's a swamp creature party, but the MAGA party movement is a populist movement. And rather than, some people thought, John, that whenever Trump lost the election, honk honk, we're on YouTube. Whenever he lost that election back in November, a lot of people thought, well, maybe he'll go and he'll start his own party, but he hasn't. He's made it clear. I mean, he's absolutely clear that the way forward has to be this alliance of populism and right-wingism. So therefore, John, I put it to you, if you follow that logic, is the way forward not creating a third party like UKIP, or trying to reinvigorate UKIP? But it would not be better for UKIP to somehow get back into bed with the Tories, kind of like MAGA-like, and change it? What do you think?
No, I'm dead against that. I just don't think it will work because I don't think the Tory party is anything like the Republican Party. There is no real democracy in the Tory party. And this was, let's not forget, this was
Mm,
what was tried just a few years ago. I
mm.
think it was Stephen Wolfe, wasn't it, and Aaron Banks who set up this blue wave, or supposedly they were going to have a blue wave to get all the UKIPers and
Oh,
others
yes,
to
that's right. Yep. Yep.
infiltrate the Tory party. Well, it failed at first base because the Tory party refused to let those two become members. So,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that just shows how the Tory party will protect its own interests. But let's be honest, even if there were 20 or 40,000 UKIPers or people of that persuasion who join the Tory party tomorrow, they would have no say over who their representatives are.
Mhm.
The Tories, Conservative Central Office always controls who becomes
Oh,
its
yeah.
MPs,
It
and
does.
it is a
Yeah.
through and through establishment party. So that's why I think the Tory party has to be defeated. It really does, and it needs a party that can do that. And
Well,
again, you see, that's why I didn't agree with what Farage did when he stood down. Autocratically overnight, he decided to stand down
mm.
all his candidates where they were challenging sitting
Oh, yeah, that was
Tory
horrific.
MPs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean that simply showed that he was only ever interested in putting pressure on the Tory party, not in supplanting it.
And that's a very good point. Yeah, I remember. I'm sure I'm on record saying it. I was horrified. I could see it coming, though. It was you could there was a pressure put on him, and he folded. But yeah, I agree with your analysis 100%. Actually, just out of interest, can I ask the stream as we're chatting, John? If anyone does anyone in the stream think that the Reform Party, being the well, I was going to say the Farage party, but it's not. It's now the Richard Tice-led party. That's an interesting one. Does anyone think this party has any chance? Just drop your comments as we're chatting here. But I have to say, John, like there's this Hartlepool Westminster by-election coming on May the 6th, and you've got Labour choosing an incredibly bad candidate up there, which we're not go into. But and then you've got the Tories putting up. I don't know if they're putting up the same person. And then you could Tice apparently eyeing up Hartlepool. Man of the people, Richard Tice, will be going up to that northeastern location to spread his easy charm. My concern is this: the Tories will win Hartlepool, and that's going to fortify what I consider to be the Johnson tyranny. And it's so depressing, the prospect. I don't see the Reform Party having any chance. Do you, by the way, either up there or anywhere else?
Well, it's hard to say, isn't it? I think in 2015, UKIP came second in Hartlepool, and I think in 2019, Richard Tice came
Third.
second, didn't
He
he?
came third.
Was
Third.
he third? Oh, sorry.
Third.
Okay.
Pretty close. He
Um,
was a very close, credible third, John.
yes,
At
that's right.
Brexit.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
But I think I'm right in saying UKIP did come second in 2015, which was, of
Might
course,
be right.
UKIP's best electoral performance. So I think that shows how the people of Hartlepool, and let's face it, Hartlepool is not dissimilar from many other towns, many other places actually outside of London and the
Yeah.
southeast, and where, to be honest, they are heartily sick, aren't they, of both Labour and the Tories.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect if one of them gets in, then it's only because they think they are marginally less bad compared to the other. And, you can only sustain that approach for so long. It's not good for our democracy if people are only voting for a party because they think they're slightly not quite as bad as the other. That there has to be a proper, credible alternative that people enthusiastically support. And I think that could be UKIP.
Well, I do. I agree with that. I see actually we have someone, John Newell, who's in the Reform Party, who's on the stream, and John's a good guy, but he doesn't know how the Reform Party will do. For me, the way I see it, that sort of UKIP became, certainly with the Farage thing anyway. The Brexit Party took its clothes, took its votes, and then the Brexit Party essentially, like Monty Python's dead parrot, has ceased to be. And it's been this Reform Party, which is some decent ideas, just like UKIP, just like the Reclaim Party, just like the For Britain party. But as is pointed out by somebody here, have we too many, John? Are there too many of these kind of parties? And all it does is just salami slice that particular vote. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think there are too many, but you see, so I think there's at least 3 or 4, maybe more parties that are all, broadly speaking, fighting over the same territory, namely to be the proper alternative to the
Yeah,
Lib Lab cons.
yeah,
And only one of them will ultimately survive. But you know that you won't be able to get those 5 to agree.
no,
Um,
no.
and you know, I happen to think that UKIP. I'm not saying it's going to. I don't know how it's going to perform. They have said they're going to stand a candidate in Hartlepool. I've no idea how UKIP might do, but I hope it does well. But if it doesn't, I suspect it's probably going to be because there's a bit of media interest over Reform UK and Reclaim because they're both newish. You know, they've got a lot of money and they're both quite media savvy, but I don't think they'll be
Yeah.
able to sustain it. And I think the building of an alternative party is a long-term project. And as I say, it's not even a project that Reform and Reclaim are even seeking to engage in.
Yeah, I think I did a stream on Friday night past with Anne Marie Waters, For Britain leader, who's a very capable and able lady as well. And again, I find when I listen to UKIP, when I listen to Reform, Reclaim, UKIP, there's very little I find very little to disagree with. It's just me sort of. It would be wrong for me to say there's any particular ideological, differences. But by the same token, when I look at the opinion polls and I look at what the great British people where they want to go, John, it's like they have to keep sort of adhering to the Lib Lab con. I mean that seems to be. It makes me wonder: are we doomed by the stupidity of the voters?
I've got a 2-word answer to that, David. Keir Hardie. The point is. Exactly the same could have been said over 100 years ago, couldn't it? When you had the Liberals and the Conservative Party, but they weren't fit for purpose. The political machine, was not fit for purpose because you had an emerging working class, and they needed to have representation. And so Keir Hardie set up the Labour Representation Committee, which then became the Labour Party, and they overtook and basically kicked out of British politics the Liberal Party. You know, that took many years, but that's exactly the same sort of process that needs to happen now, because it's not so much the working class which is excluded, unless you want to define the working class in a particular kind of way. But most ordinary people do not feel as if their voice is being heard at the moment. In fact, we know that the political class is contemptuous of most ordinary people, that is a situation which cannot last.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The existing political establishment is horrified by the ordinary people. I mean, the fact they've been able to lock them down for a year must give them great pleasure to stop them from being able to go out and say what they actually think. I'm sure that's right. I think what I love, John, about people like yourself and some of the others who come on the stream is you're all so much more optimistic than me, and that's great because I fear I may be just too jaded although I still like to quote that one-liner. You know, what is a pessimist? Well, a pessimist is an optimist mugged by reality. I still think, that's a good argument as well. You know, but for sure, Britain needs change. We absolutely do. We can't continue. We just cannot go on with what we have, John. That's for sure. And I also would say, and I've said this before, so it's not saying anything surprising. Some of the very nicest people I've met in politics have been from UKIP. I have to say that. I've met loads of UKIP people. Some of you in the stream are UKIP. Others, you know, not. I haven't. The one person I've never really had any deep conversations with is Farage, but then he's too high up. But at ground level, the rank and file, John, that bring the message, they impressed me so much. I've spoken at UKIP meetings, just on my own topics, but I find them a great bunch of people. But I think UKIP's gone through such a ringer that it'd be really interesting to see, is there a way back from what looked like the abyss. And if there is, then I'm sure having, John, people like yourself, capable speakers and knowledgeable, that's the way to do it, you know. So I think, you know, in summary, I would wish yourself and UKIP well. I do wish the other parties well as well. I just want to see what we have swept away. I want this behind me, this image behind me. It needs to be fumigated. It needs to be fumigated. The ordinary British man and woman whose everyday needs, which have been completely ignored, John, needs to be represented in there. And it's not. It's an embarrassment, don't you think, the Commons, when you say it?
Oh, absolutely. But I mean, on this pessimism point, David, let's just go back 5 years. I mean, it go back to the pre-Brexit referendum. Back before Trump. You know, both events happened in the latter half of 2016, didn't they?
Yeah.
And, you know, both of those events were massive steps forward for ordinary people. You know, that's when the populist movement was seen to exist in Britain, in America, and also more broadly in Europe. And if you look now, you know, Trump lost the election, but he's not gone away. He's certainly in control of the Republican Party in America. And I don't see any weakening for populist ideas in this country either. And, you know, you look in France, where you can see Le Pen is putting up a very good fight, it looks like, with Macron.
Yes.
You know, and all the established parties are finding it pretty much impossible to connect with their electorates. So that gives us hope, doesn't it? There's been setbacks, but if you look at the broader sweep over the last 5 years, it seems to me that there is a movement which is still continuing to go forwards.
Yeah, you're right, John, and that's probably a good note to finish on. I think populism, John, hasn't gone away, and you know, in some regards, when you look at their efforts to sort of clamp down on populism, that's can be for but one reason, because they fear it. And whether we see this in France next year when Macron and Le Pen lock horns again, and let's face it, France isn't looking good at the moment. That might be a moment, and we might see it in other countries around the world. But the country I would love to see it most is this one. This is the country that I want to see. All the UKIP fought for British reasserting, getting our sovereignty back, John, as you know, for making this country, to link it back into its proud history and give it a global future. All those things, I don't think those things can be delivered by the globalist cabalists that we have in Downing Street and the Treasury. We need that absolute change. And let's hope we get it. But John, listen, our hour has gone by way too quickly, which is sadly always the way. But thank you very much for being back on the stream. It's a real pleasure to have you here with us this evening, John. So thank you for being here. Thank all you folks. I've noticed your comments on the stream. And thanks for being part of this tonight. And I shall be back with you in Wednesday night. I've got a lady called Alana Mercer. Google Alana Mercer. And she's an American lady, very forthright, hyper clever person. So you should definitely join that one. That's going to go out at 8 p.m. on Wednesday night. So join me then. There'll be other stuff between now and then. But that someone says, not Alanis Morissette. No, not Alanis Morissette. Alana Mercer. ILHANAMERCER. You'll see the thing. Anyway, yes, Alana's really good. You'll enjoy that one. Thanks for being here anyway. That's enough for me. Cue exit. We're done.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.